Did you know that 100,000 people, which were about 2 army corps, needed 75 tons of bread, 50 tons of meat, 25 tons of dried vegetables, 2.5 tons each of coffee and salt, and 11,450 liters of additional brandy in just one day? Later on, we'll come back to these numbers, because today we're diving into a fascinating yet often overlooked aspect of military history: the development of military nutrition in the 19th century up to World War I. We'll explore how soldiers' rations evolved, the scientific insights that influenced them, and how the famous Iron Ration came to be. So stay tuned. Over time, the need for compact and nutritious emergency food led to groundbreaking developments in military provisioning. The Iron Ration became a crucial component in ensuring soldier survival during warfare. While the introduction of universal conscription in the early 19th century, soldiers often had to procure their own food. It wasn't until the late 18th century that states like Prussia began issuing daily bread portions. By 1799, Prussian soldiers received 561 grams of bread per day. In the 1830s and 1840s, a second portion was added, including meat, legumes, and grains. However, cooking remained the soldiers' responsibility. During wars, rations consisted of durable foods like potatoes, hardtack, and salted meat, while daily meat portions were often higher than those of civilians. The quality was poor. Brandy played an essential role, not just as a stimulant, but also to make poor quality food more palatable. Soldiers often faced monotonous diets with deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, which sometimes led to health problems like scurvy. Yes, not only the navies had their problems with it, but also the armies. In times of prolonged conflict, food shortages worsened. Soldiers often resorted to scavenging or supplementing their diet with whatever was available. During the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, troops frequently suffered from hunger when supply lines were disrupted. The lack of standardized nutrition also meant that soldiers' endurance and overall health varied widely, affecting military effectiveness. By the mid-19th century, scientists like Carl von Voigt began systematically studying soldiers' diets. He found that the rations lacked sufficient protein and fat and recommended an optimal peacetime diet of 119 grams of protein, 56 grams of fat, and 485 grams of carbohydrates. However, implementation was costly, and the military made only minor adjustments. After the 1866 war against Austria, Prussia slightly increased meat rations, and brandy was partly replaced with coffee. During the Franco-Prussian War 1870-71, coffee mills and burners became standard equipment. Despite these changes, fundamental reforms remained limited. While nutritional analyses were conducted, financial constraints often prevented recommendations from being implemented. Vargas noted in 1902 that although there were efforts to improve military nutrition, many proposed measures were simply too expensive to be realized. Interestingly, the army's planning for horse feed was often more detailed than for soldiers' food, highlighting the priority placed on cavalry mobility over troop sustenance. Schmidt observed in 1909 that the too meticulous organization of horse feed contrasted sharply with the still under development science of human nutrition within the military. By the late 19th century, military doctors and chemists took a more active role in refining rations. The emergence of food chemistry allowed for better preservation techniques such as canning and dehydration, making it possible to store and transport food for longer periods. However, many innovations remained underutilized due to cost and logistical challenges. The immense demand: 100,000 people needed 75 tons of bread, 50 tons of meat, 25 tons of dried vegetables, 2.5 tons each of coffee and salt, as well as 11,450 liters of additional brandy just in one day, posed considerable storage problems, especially as the organization of the warehouse structures in the state were by no means organized. In addition, there were considerable quality problems, as the food often suffered during transport and the local quantities were often below the usual quality requirements. There were acute supply problems due to the railway congestion at the beginning of September 1870, when thousands of railway wagons loaded with bread, flour and grain piled up on the stage, as there was a lack of staff to unload them, and there was hardly any storage space. Standing in the rain, the provisions quickly spoiled. The situation was similarly critical at the beginning of January 1870, when the supply came to a partial standstill due to snow and ice. The traditional supply endeavors proved to be less suitable for the rapid war of movement. The mobilization of troops went hand in hand with the mobilization of large herds of cattle. Initially, there were only problems with the quality of fresh meat. The fresh meat had to be hung for at least a day or two in order to be flavorsome and digestible. After a short time, cattle epidemics ravaged large herds. The cured meat that was also brought along had to be soaked for a long time and was often only eaten with reluctance by the soldiers, and could only be given for a short time. Otherwise, there was a risk of scurvy. Finally, the prolonged war effort also revealed that it was not enough to hand out food for the soldiers, but that it also had to be prepared. Due to a lack of cooking skills, boiling the men's food was a particular health hazard. The longer, the more often eating out became noticeable. The monotony of the unpalatable field fare could only be alleviated, but not fundamentally alleviated, by settler officers. So that we have heard about all the problems with the food, now let us focus a bit closer on the iron ration. The iron ration was the combat food par excellence. In the Prussian army, since the rations regulations of 1867, this meant a 3-day portion consisting of bread or rusks, rice or pearl barley or groats, salt and coffee, which the soldier had to carry with him on the march. It could and was usually supplemented with bacon or salted meat. It weighed almost 3 kilograms, which was in addition to the approx 30 kilogram equipment in the field knapsack, and could only be eaten on command. The weaknesses of this form of catering, which was based on everyday food, became apparent during the war against France. The soldiers were already faced with major problems when it came to storing the food. The knapsacks and saddlebags were simply too small. The heat built up in them, and rusks and especially bacon spoiled within a short time. They were often thrown away unused. Supply problems made regular replacement impossible, and the food could often not be prepared. The flavor left a lot to be desired, and doctors criticized the low protein and especially fat content. From the end of 1870, sausage and pressed coffee were often served instead of the iron ration, but their acceptance of these also dwindled. Accordingly, after the war, a debate started on how these deficits could be remedied. The demands on the new diet were high, as the iron ration was supposed to be a dish that can be enjoyed at any moment without any preparation, and this food had to be tasty and appetizing. It also had to be durable, light, compact, inexpensive, and balanced. Analog ideas had already been propagated by nutritional scientists in the middle of the century. The food had to be a kind of nutritional quintessence that would provide the body with all nutrients, but at the same time spare the burden of indigestible substances. The aim was to produce concentrated and preserved food, which was discussed at the time under the term tinned food. It cannot be reduced to canned food, as its production was not yet mechanized in the 1870s and primarily involved vegetables. Tinned food was at the center of discussions after the war against France, as they were used in the second phase of the war and until 1872. The experience of the French army was utilized in the occupied canning factory in Nancy. As in the later German canneries, the aim here was to mechanize production, standardization of heat sterilization, a wider range of food, and better flavor. The more contemporaries knew about everyday military life, the more they emphasized the palatability of the food preserves could not simply be introduced, but habits had to be broken, and the prejudice against food produced or prepared foods had to be overcome. The canned food shy had to be informed about the advantages of combat food. However, there were hardly any mediation efforts of this kind. The debate was rather characterized by military strategical or nutritional physiological considerations. The military saw tinned food primarily as an accelerating factor. Ideally, tinned food offered a mobile supply of strength that made the troops more independent of the real services, which promoted offensive operations, and at the same time strengthened the planning competence of the staff. Standardized food seemed to lead to standardized performance. The few German canning factories produced considerable quantities. In Mainz, in 3 months in 1880, around 500,150 grams portions of tinned meat and 600,000 portions of tinned vegetables and pressed coffee. But these were not enough to build up relevant stocks for a longer campaign. The preserves were used up during the annual autumn maneuvers, and the rations did not yet include them. The trials carried out by the military improved process knowledge. The quality control tinned food was much more pronounced than in the private sector. Leaking cans or cans contaminated with solder were largely prevented. Botulism could be almost completely avoided. Based on internal military trials, an improved field rusk was then introduced, which consisted of wheat and potato flour, and sugar, which, like the meat rusk, was replaced in 1901 by a so-called egg rusk, which consisted of wheat and potato flour, sugar, eggs or dried egg yolk, and milk. This was, as was the introduction of tinned meat and vegetables in the 1901 war catering regulations. This was an expression and result of the growing importance of nutritional and technological knowledge within the military. Since then, the iron ration consisted of 3 daily portions of 250 grams of egg or field rusks, 200 grams of tinned meat, and 150 grams of tinned vegetables, 25 grams of salt, and 25 grams of coffee. The iron ration remained an emergency food with reflected deficits. The supply of iron rations was insufficient. Before World War I, it was only enough portions were available for the Kaiser maneuvers, highlighting the logistical shortcomings of large-scale implementation. Lessons from colonial wars were used to test artificial food under extreme conditions. Military administrations utilized experiences from colonial wars and the field operations of protection forces to assess the effectiveness of artificial rations in extreme conditions. In conclusion, military nutrition up to World War I was influenced by scientific advancements, yet many reforms were slow due to financial and logistical constraints. The introduction of the iron ration was a milestone in ensuring minimum sustenance for soldiers, even if practical emplacements often fell short of potential improvements. The internal knowledge building process within the German army was shaped by the increasing professionalism of military doctors, chemists, and pharmacists. Nutritional calculations increasingly influenced daily rations and meal composition in peacetime, and dictated military nutrition during wartime. However, military constraints meant that efficiency improvements were often prioritized over comprehensive nutritional quality. Despite broad acceptance of scientific findings, some aspects, such as the relatively low fat content in German rations, remained unchanged. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good one and see you next time.